The Murder of Liam Gray, True Crime Documentary, 2025. It was a cold, foggy night in the small town of Brockford. The streets were empty, only the soft hum of distant traffic breaking the silence. Liam Gray walked down the alley, his footsteps echoing against the damp walls. The smell of rain and wet concrete filled the air. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the scene. Liam glanced over his shoulder, a sudden feeling of unease creeping up his spine. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end was distorted, raspy, almost mechanical. "Run." A chill ran down Liam's back. "Who is this?" he asked, his heart racing. The line went dead. Liam's breath quickened as he glanced around, the hairs on his neck standing tall. The air felt thick, suffocating. Something was wrong. He picked up his pace, his footsteps now frantic. He could hear someone following him. The sound of footsteps, too close, too deliberate. He turned the corner, eyes darting, scanning the shadows. The street seemed abandoned, yet every movement felt magnified. Suddenly, a figure stepped into view, a tall man, cloaked in darkness. Liam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" Liam called out, his voice trembling. But the figure didn't answer. He only took one step forward, and then another. Closer. Closer. Liam backed up, his mind racing. His body screamed to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The sound of his own breath was deafening in his ears. The figure raised a hand. A knife glinted in the dim light. Before Liam could react, the cold steel sliced through the air, piercing his side. Pain surged through him, sharp and brutal. Liam gasped, stumbling backward, unable to comprehend what was happening. The fog thickened, and his vision blurred. He reached out, his fingers grazing the wall for support, but it was too late. Another strike. This time, it was fatal. The figure disappeared into the mist, leaving nothing but a blood-stained alley. Liam Gray's lifeless body crumpled to the ground. His final breath was a whisper lost to the cold night. No one heard the cries. No one saw the killer. Only the shadows remained, hiding the truth. And in the quiet aftermath, the town would never be the same. The murder of Liam Gray would echo in their minds forever. Days passed, but the town of Brockford remained in a state of uneasy silence. The police were called, the scene was investigated, but there were no leads. The killer had vanished without a trace. Liam's family, devastated by the loss, held on to the hope that justice would be served. But with each passing day, that hope began to fade. Detective Sarah Monroe, a seasoned investigator, was assigned to the case. She studied the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. A blood-stained alley, a few scattered footprints, but nothing that could point her to a suspect. The more she looked, the less she understood. The townspeople whispered, afraid that the killer was still among them. The case went cold. Months turned into a year, and still no answers. But then an anonymous tip came in. A woman's voice, trembling with fear, spoke into the phone. "I know who did it, but you'll never believe me." Detective Monroe's pulse quickened. This could be the break she needed. The woman, who refused to reveal her identity, said that Liam Gray's murder wasn't random. It was planned, carefully executed by someone close to him. Someone he knew. The detective arranged a meeting with the woman, desperate for any shred of information. When they met, the woman's eyes darted nervously around the room. "I can't give you a name," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can tell you this. It's someone who's still living in Brockford." A feeling of dread settled over Sarah Monroe. The town she thought she knew was hiding something dark, something it wasn't ready to reveal. She dug deeper, speaking to friends, family, even Liam's ex-girlfriend. But no one seemed to know anything. Until one evening, while revisiting the alley where Liam had been killed, Monroe noticed something. A single, faint footprint that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. She bent down, her heart racing as she studied it. It was fresh, too fresh. The detective followed the trail, the ground beneath her feet seeming to pulse with every step. The fog was thick once again, and the air felt heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Then, in the distance, she saw something. An abandoned house, dark and foreboding. It had been vacant for years, or so she thought. She approached cautiously, her breath shallow as she reached for the door. It creaked open with an eerie sound, and she stepped inside. The smell of dust and decay filled her nostrils. But something else lingered, something unnatural. And then she saw it. A room at the back, dimly lit by a flickering bulb. In the center of the room, an old wooden box sat on the floor. The lid was slightly ajar. Monroe's instincts told her not to open it, but she did anyway. What she found inside would haunt her forever. A bloodstained shirt, a knife, and a photograph of Liam Gray, taken just days before his death. It was clear now. The killer had been watching him, and they had left a message. But the true horror lay in the realization that the person responsible for Liam's death was closer than anyone could have imagined. The quiet town of Brockford was not what it seemed. And in the shadows, the killer was still out there, waiting. Detective Monroe stood frozen, staring at the photograph of Liam. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. She carefully placed the photograph back into the box, her fingers trembling. The room seemed to close in around her, thick with the weight of the discovery. The air was heavy with dread, the smell of decay now mingling with the unmistakable scent of fear. As she backed away from the box, her eyes caught something on the wall, a series of faded chalk markings. Lines, circles, and symbols that seemed out of place. Monroe's heart skipped a beat. The markings were too deliberate to be random. Could they be a message? A clue left behind by the killer? She took out her phone, snapping a picture of the strange symbols. Her pulse quickened. She had to find out what they meant. Just as she was about to leave, the sound of a creaking floorboard behind her made her freeze. Slowly, she turned. Her eyes scanned the room, but there was no one there. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't alone. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Monroe's breath hitched, her body tensing. She rushed to the door, but it was locked. Her mind raced. Who could be here with her? She pulled out her gun, her hand steady despite the rising panic. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady but tight. No answer, just the sound of her own breathing. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The tension in the air was suffocating. And then she saw it, a shadow slipping past the crack in the door. Before she could react, the door flung open, revealing a figure standing in the threshold. It was a man, tall and unrecognizable, his face hidden in the darkness, his body cloaked in shadows. Monroe raised her gun, her hands shaking with adrenaline. "Stop right there," she ordered. But the figure didn't move. He only stared, his presence filling the room with an unexplainable menace. The silence between them was thick, heavy, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. Then, without a word, the figure stepped back into the shadows. Monroe lunged forward, but by the time she reached the door, the figure was gone. She rushed outside, scanning the street for any sign of him. The fog was thicker now, blurring everything around her. Her heart pounded in her chest. The person who had been watching Liam, the one who had left the clues, was still out there. And just as quickly as the fear had gripped her, it was replaced by something darker. A chilling realization that she was no longer just solving a murder. She had become part of the game. The killer knew she was close, and he wasn't done yet. Detective Monroe's every step was now measured, each movement weighed down by the knowledge that the killer was still watching. She wasn't just pursuing a murderer anymore. She was being hunted. Her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Monroe," a voice hissed on the other end, barely audible over the static. "You're getting closer, but you're still too late." The line went dead. Monroe's blood ran cold. Whoever was behind this knew her every move. The game had shifted. She rushed back to her car, but as she pulled out onto the deserted streets, her headlights caught something in the distance. A figure standing by the Old Town Bridge, barely visible in the mist. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. This was the lead she'd been waiting for. With her heart hammering in her chest, she drove toward the bridge. As she neared, the figure stepped forward, revealing a face she knew all too well. It was Liam's ex-girlfriend, Sophie, pale, shaken, and drenched in fear. "Sophie," Monroe called, stopping the car. The woman's eyes were wide, her body trembling. "I've been trying to reach you," she whispered. "You need to listen to me." Monroe stepped out of the car, her pulse racing. "What's going on? What do you know?" Sophie took a shaky breath. "The man who killed Liam, he wasn't just anyone. He was part of something much bigger, something we didn't see coming." Monroe's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about? Who is he?" Sophie's gaze shifted nervously, and she lowered her voice. "I can't tell you everything, but I can show you." Without another word, she turned and began walking down the path leading to the Old Town Cemetery. Monroe followed, unsure of what to expect, but knowing this could be her last chance to get to the truth. They reached a small, secluded grave site. Sophie crouched down, brushing away the leaves from a weathered headstone. Liam's name was engraved there, but there was something strange about the dates. They didn't match. Monroe knelt beside her, studying the grave. "The dates, they're wrong," she murmured. Sophie nodded. "Because he wasn't who he said he was?" Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. "He had secrets, and I think that's why he was killed." Suddenly, Monroe's phone vibrated again. A text. She glanced at it quickly. "Asterisk, you're on the wrong track. Stop before it's too late. There's more at stake here than you know." Asterisk. The message sent a chill through her. Monroe looked back at Sophie, whose face was now pale with terror. "Is this why you've been hiding?" Monroe asked urgently. Sophie nodded, her voice trembling. "You have no idea what you're getting into. The killer isn't just a person. It's a force that goes deeper into the heart of Brockford. The secrets run too deep." Before Monroe could respond, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate steps. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. The fog grew denser, swallowing the cemetery whole. And in the distance, she saw it, the faint glow of headlights cutting through the mist. Someone was coming. Someone who knew she was close to the truth. Monroe turned to Sophie, her face grim. "We need to go now." But as they began to leave, the sound of a car engine roaring to life echoed through the fog. And in that moment, the chilling truth hit Monroe. The game wasn't over yet, that Monroe's heart raced as she grabbed Sophie's arm, pulling her away from the grave site. The distant roar of the car engine grew louder, closer, its headlights cutting through the fog like searching eyes. "Move!" Monroe urged, dragging Sophie toward her car. They could hear the tires screeching on the wet asphalt as the vehicle approached. Monroe's mind raced, calculating the distance, the time. It was too close. Sophie stumbled, her breath ragged with fear. "Who's coming?" she gasped. Monroe didn't answer. Her only focus was the road ahead, but deep down, she knew. Whoever was following them wasn't just some random threat. They reached the car, and Monroe shoved Sophie into the passenger seat. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the keys, the car's engine finally roaring to life. But before she could pull away, a figure appeared in the rearview mirror. It was a man, tall and covered in shadow, standing in the middle of the road. Monroe slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches from him. The figure stepped forward, his face still hidden in the darkness. But this time, Monroe saw something in his hand, a weapon, glinting menacingly in the moonlight. She didn't hesitate. She threw the car into reverse, speeding backward, heart hammering in her chest. The figure lunged toward them, his movements unnaturally fast. Monroe's mind screamed at her to drive, to escape, but her foot was frozen on the brake. The figure was too close now. Suddenly, the headlights of the car behind them illuminated the scene. Another vehicle, moving fast, speeding toward them. It was a black SUV, windows tinted, engine roaring like a predator. Monroe's eyes widened in horror. Before she could react, the SUV slammed into her car, throwing it forward with a force that almost sent her into a spin. The air was filled with the screeching of metal, the tires screaming in protest. Monroe's grip tightened on the wheel as she fought to regain control. But the damage had already been done. The rearview mirror shattered, the car's frame bent, and smoke began to billow from the engine. "Get out!" Monroe shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. Sophie looked at her, wide-eyed, frozen in fear. The figure from the road was approaching them again, his footsteps deliberate, slow, almost mocking. Monroe threw open the door, pulling Sophie out with her, and they ran toward the woods nearby. The sound of heavy boots on gravel echoed behind them, growing louder. Monroe's pulse was deafening in her ears, but she couldn't stop. Not now. They reached the edge of the trees when Monroe heard it. A voice, cold and familiar. "Stop running, detective." It was the voice from the phone, the voice of the killer. Monroe turned, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun, but the figure was too close. He was almost upon them now, his face still obscured in the shadows, but his presence unmistakable. "I warned you," the voice hissed. And then the world seemed to go still. The fog rolled in thicker than ever, swallowing everything in its path. Monroe's breath caught in her throat as she finally saw the man's face, half lit by the dim light. It wasn't just any killer. It was someone she knew. Her blood ran cold as recognition flashed across her mind. The man standing before her wasn't a stranger. He was someone from her own past. "Liam," she whispered. But it wasn't Liam. It couldn't be. The figure stepped forward, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "You're too late, detective," he said. "The truth was never what you thought it was." The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The killer had been playing her from the start. But now, the truth was too horrifying to ignore. Liam Gray wasn't the victim. He had been a pawn, caught in a game that Monroe had only just begun to understand. Monroe's heart raced, her mind scrambling to process the impossible. Liam Gray wasn't the victim? The figure before her grinned, his eyes gleaming with a chilling satisfaction. Liam knew too much. "He got in the way," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "You think this is just a murder mystery, detective. You think you're hunting a killer. But you're hunting something much darker." Monroe's thoughts swirled, every instinct screaming to escape. But she couldn't run now. She needed answers. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. The figure stepped closer, the shadows parting slightly to reveal his face more clearly. It wasn't Liam, not anymore. This was a man with a twisted sense of satisfaction, a cruel expression that Monroe would never forget. "Don't you get it, detective?" he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was always here, watching, waiting. You think the town of Brockford is just a small, quiet place? It's not. Not anymore." Monroe's chest tightened. The fog swirled around them, an oppressive, suffocating presence. She tried to steady her breathing. "Why did you kill him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam's face, the one she had seen so many times, flashed in her mind. She could still picture him, his youthful face, his future stolen away. And now this nightmare. The man's grin widened. Liam was a liability, a loose end. But he wasn't the only one, he said, his voice almost gleeful. "You, Detective Monroe, you're next." Monroe's eyes narrowed as she backed away. The realization hit her hard. She had walked right into the trap. This man wasn't just a killer. He was orchestrating something far bigger than her investigation could have ever prepared for. Before she could respond, the man lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a force that sent a shock through her entire body. "You can't stop it. It's already begun," he hissed. She struggled, trying to break free from his grip, but his hold was ironclad. And then the most terrifying thing happened. Out of the mist, another figure appeared. This one was different, calm, controlled, but unmistakably dangerous. Monroe's heart sank. This wasn't just a lone killer. This was part of a network, a conspiracy far larger than she could have ever imagined. The second figure stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Monroe with a chilling sense of recognition. "I told you to stop, detective," he said softly, almost apologetically. "But now you're in too deep." The first man holding her sneered. "She's not getting away. Not this time." Monroe's mind raced. She had underestimated the danger, underestimated the depth of the shadows she was standing in. But now, trapped between the two figures, her only chance was to think fast. She was no longer the hunter. She had become the prey. Without warning, Monroe jerked her arm free, her body moving instinctively. She dove to the side, pulling her gun from her holster in a swift motion. The sound of the gunshot rang out, sharp and deafening. But it wasn't enough. The figure closest to her ducked, narrowly avoiding the bullet. Monroe's heart pounded as she tried to regain her stance, but her surroundings seemed to blur. Fog, shadows, and the weight of a coming storm. The second figure stepped forward, his calm demeanor never faltering. "You can't fight us, detective. You're too far gone," he said. "You should have stayed away from Brockford." Monroe's eyes darted around, but there was nowhere to run. Her gun was the only thing that kept them at bay. She was outnumbered, trapped. But there was still one thing she knew. She couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. "I won't stop until I uncover the truth," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Whatever this is, I'll expose it." The first figure let out a low laugh, his voice cold as ice. "You think you can stop what's already in motion? You think the truth matters anymore?" And then, everything went dark. The world seemed to collapse around her. The fog, the figures, the pain, it all faded away as if someone had flipped a switch. The last thing Monroe felt was a hand on her shoulder, steadying her before everything went black. The murder of Liam Gray was only the beginning. The real truth, the one Monroe was about to uncover, would change everything forever. Monroe awoke with a jolt, her head pounding, her vision blurred. She was no longer in the foggy cemetery. The air was thick, sterile, and the cold touch of metal beneath her fingertips made her realize she was on a table, an operating table. Her heart raced as she tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The dim, flickering lights above her only added to the disorienting atmosphere. It was a hospital room, or something that resembled one. She blinked, trying to gather her senses, but the fog of confusion still clouded her mind. Where was Sophie? Had she escaped? What happened after the gunshot? A door creaked open. The sound was almost comforting in the silence that surrounded her. A figure entered, tall, thin, dressed in a lab coat. Monroe's eyes widened. It was the second man, the one who had spoken to her calmly, almost sympathetically, in the cemetery. "You're awake," he said, his voice measured, devoid of emotion. Monroe's pulse quickened. "What have you done to me?" she demanded, her voice hoarse but firm. "You're in no condition to be making threats, detective," he replied, his eyes scanning her face as if calculating. "It's better this way. You'll understand soon." Monroe's breath caught in her throat. Her mind flashed back to the cemetery, to the killer's face, to the cold certainty in his words. She couldn't let this happen. She had to get out. "What is this?" she asked again, her voice shaking. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to a counter in the corner of the room, picking up a syringe. The sight of it made her stomach drop. "You won't remember much, but you'll remember enough," he said, turning back toward her, the syringe in his hand gleaming in the dim light. Monroe struggled, trying to break free from the restraints that held her down, but it was no use. The sedatives were taking their toll on her. Her vision began to swim, but she fought to stay awake. "Why?" she whispered. "Why Liam?" The man's expression didn't change. "Liam was never the target," he said, almost regretfully. "It's always been you. We needed you to see the truth, but you had to get closer." He paused, his voice growing colder. "Now, you're too deep in it. You'll never get out." Monroe felt a wave of fear wash over her as he approached. But in that moment, a surge of clarity broke through the fog in her mind. She couldn't afford to let him control the narrative. With every ounce of strength, she pushed against the restraints. "Get away from me," she shouted, her body fighting to break free. The man took a step back, startled by her sudden burst of energy. For a fleeting moment, Monroe saw the doubt in his eyes. This was her chance. In one swift motion, she grabbed a metal tray from beside her and hurled it at him. The tray struck him in the chest, knocking him backward. Monroe's hands were still bound, but she was no longer helpless. She kicked the table in frustration, her body flooding with adrenaline. The door was just ahead. If she could make it there, she might stand a chance. With every ounce of power left in her, Monroe surged forward. She tore at the restraints, her movements desperate and frantic. Finally, with a snap, the binds gave way. She reached for the door handle, heart hammering in her chest. Just as her hand touched the cold metal, the door burst open again. This time it wasn't the man in the lab coat. It was someone else, a figure she didn't recognize, but who exuded the same cold, calculating menace. He stepped into the room, his eyes locked on Monroe. "I was wondering when you'd wake up," he said with a twisted smile. "Too bad you're too late." Before Monroe could react, the figure lunged. But this time, she was ready. She sidestepped him, grabbing a nearby chair and using it as a weapon. The chair hit him square in the chest, forcing him backward, giving Monroe just enough time to dash out the door. The hallway was long and dark, the walls lined with doors leading to unknown rooms. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the corridor, her mind focused only on escape. But she knew she was being hunted. The danger hadn't passed. It had just begun. And whoever was behind this was far more dangerous than anyone she had ever faced. Monroe rounded a corner. But to her horror, she saw another figure ahead. There was no way out. She was cornered. Her mind raced. Then she saw it, an open window. Without a second thought, Monroe launched herself toward it, throwing herself through the opening just as the figures closed in behind her. The world outside was cold, dark, and unfamiliar. But Monroe didn't stop. She ran, every muscle in her body screaming for rest, but she couldn't stop. The truth, whatever it was out there, and she would stop at nothing to uncover it. Monroe stumbled through the dense, overgrown woods, the cold night air cutting through her clothes, but she didn't dare stop to rest. The weight of her breath came in ragged gasps, but her determination outweighed the exhaustion. Her mind raced, every thought centered on one thing: escape. Who were these people? Why was she being hunted? And most importantly, what was the truth about Liam Gray's death? Every sound in the woods felt like it was chasing her. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of branches, the distant howl of wolves. Her senses were on high alert, but she couldn't let fear cloud her focus. Then in the distance she saw it, a flicker of light. A house, or perhaps a cabin, standing eerily alone against the vast expanse of the woods. Monroe didn't hesitate. She made a beeline for it, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs aching with each step. As she neared the structure, the light from a window cast long shadows across the dirt path leading to the door. Monroe approached cautiously, every nerve on edge, every step calculated. She wasn't sure if the light was a sign of safety or another trap, but she had no other option. Her hand reached for the door, and before she could knock, it creaked open slowly. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light inside. It was a woman, tall, with sharp features, her expression unreadable. "Who are you?" Monroe demanded, her voice raw but steady. The woman's eyes flickered briefly with recognition. "I could ask you the same," she replied, her tone cautious, yet oddly calm. Monroe didn't lower her guard. "I'm Detective Monroe. I'm being chased, and I need answers." The woman studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in quickly. They'll find you if you stay out here." Monroe hesitated for a split second before stepping inside. The room was sparsely furnished, with a wood stove crackling in the corner, providing the only warmth in the otherwise cold atmosphere. She noticed the walls were lined with maps and photographs, some of which included Liam Gray's face. Her stomach turned. "Who are you?" Monroe repeated, her voice softer this time. The woman closed the door behind her and locked it with a quiet click. "My name is Ava. I used to work with Liam," she said, her voice heavy with both sorrow and caution. Monroe's heart skipped a beat. "Liam worked with you? Why didn't he ever mention you?" Ava looked away, as if grappling with something painful. "Liam didn't know the full story," she replied quietly. "He was trying to uncover something bigger than all of us. Something dangerous. But by the time he realized what was really going on, it was too late." Monroe's pulse quickened. "You're talking about the conspiracy, aren't you? The one that goes deeper than the murder?" Ava nodded slowly. "It's much more than just Liam's death. This has been going on for years, decades even. There's a shadow network, a web of corruption, and they've been manipulating people, controlling information, hiding the truth. And Liam, he stumbled too close to it. Monroe felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. I've been trying to piece it together. Who are they? Who's behind it all? Ava's eyes flickered to the window nervously, as if expecting someone to be watching. They're everywhere. And they have eyes everywhere, Monroe. The people chasing you aren't just random criminals. They're part of something far more dangerous. If they know you're with me, they won't hesitate to come after both of us. Monroe nodded, trying to control the rising panic. But why me, she asked. Why am I involved? I didn't even know Liam was. Ava cut her off. Because you're the key. You've been investigating Liam's murder. You've been asking the right questions. That's why they've been trying to keep you quiet. You're getting too close to the truth. Monroe's mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. The truth. What's the truth? Ava? What was Liam trying to uncover? Ava hesitated for a moment, as if she were debating whether to tell Monroe everything. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and tense. Liam wasn't just investigating a murder. He was uncovering a network of people, powerful people, who've been involved in illegal activities, money laundering, human trafficking, even political corruption. But the worst part? They've been manipulating the system, erasing evidence, silencing anyone who gets too close. Monroe's breath caught in her throat. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. This isn't just about Liam anymore, is it? Ava looked at her grimly. No, it's about everyone who's ever been silenced by them. The room seemed to close in on Monroe. She had walked into this case believing she was just solving a murder. But now, she was standing on the edge of something far darker. Monroe's voice was steady, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. What's the next move? How do I stop them? Ava's face hardened, and she stepped forward, placing a hand on Monroe's shoulder. You're already in it now, detective. There's no turning back. But you can stop them. You have to. Monroe looked at her, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. One thing was clear. The truth about Liam's murder was only the surface of a much larger conspiracy. And no matter how dangerous it became, Monroe couldn't stop now. She was in this for the long haul. Monroe's mind buzzed with the weight of Ava's words. The truth was closer now than ever, but so was the danger. She had come to Brockford expecting to solve a simple murder case. But in reality, she had stumbled into a labyrinth of corruption, deceit, and shadows. The people behind it were powerful, untouchable in most eyes. But Monroe had always been someone who refused to look the other way. Ava was right. There was no turning back. As she paced the small cabin, Monroe's thoughts raced, trying to strategize her next move. The truth wasn't just something she could uncover by going through the motions. It was a battle now. A battle with forces far beyond her comprehension. Ava watched her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They won't stop coming for you, Ava warned. Not until they've finished what they started. Monroe turned to face her, her eyes hard. They're not the only ones who can fight dirty. The resolve in her voice surprised even her. But it was true. She had nothing left to lose. She wasn't just a detective anymore. She was a woman on a mission. And she would stop at nothing to bring down the ones responsible for Liam's death and everything else that came with it. Ava nodded, as if understanding exactly what Monroe meant. I can help you, she said softly. But you'll need to trust me, detective. The road ahead won't be easy. Monroe's gaze never wavered. I don't need easy. I need answers. And I will do whatever it takes. Ava's lips pressed into a tight line. We'll have to move fast, she said, standing and going over to the map on the wall. Everything they've done, every lead you've followed, it's all connected. We have to hit them where it hurts, and we have to do it before they can silence you like they did with Liam. Monroe approached the map, studying the locations marked with red pins and notes. Each one was a clue, a lead she had ignored, thinking it was unrelated. But now it all made sense. They've been using the town as a front, Monroe said, her finger tracing one of the locations. This isn't just about money or power. They've been manipulating everything, people, businesses, information, all for control. Ava nodded grimly. And they've been hiding in plain sight, using people like Liam to do their dirty work. But he got too close. Monroe stood tall, her determination stealing with every passing second. We can't wait any longer. We need to take them down now. Ava hesitated. It won't be easy. They're always watching. They'll have eyes everywhere you go. Monroe turned back to her, her expression fierce. I know, but they made the mistake of underestimating me. Ava's eyes softened, and for the first time, Monroe saw a glimmer of hope in them. Then let's do this. As they made plans, Monroe knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger than she could have ever anticipated. The shadows were closing in, but she wasn't backing down. The path to the truth was treacherous, filled with danger and uncertainty. But Monroe was ready. The fight for justice was no longer just her job, it was her purpose. And as the first light of dawn broke through the trees outside, Monroe knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't stop until every last secret was uncovered. The first light of dawn cast a faint glow over the cabin, and for a moment, Monroe felt a fleeting sense of peace. But that feeling quickly vanished, replaced by the cold reality of the fight ahead. She looked out the window, the dark silhouettes of trees now softened by the morning light. This was just the calm before the storm. Ava was busy preparing supplies, stacking maps, and organizing papers. Monroe couldn't help but admire her. Ava had been in the game long before Monroe had even begun investigating Liam's death. She was a seasoned ally, and Monroe was starting to trust her more than anyone she had ever worked with. We're not just up against criminals, Monroe said, her voice steady as she stared at the map. They're like ghosts. No one sees them, but they control everything. How do we even begin to fight something like that? Ava paused, her eyes narrowing. One step at a time, we start by hitting their weakest points. Find the people who know the truth and are too scared to speak up. We expose their lies, one by one. Monroe nodded. People are scared, but they're also looking for someone to stand up. They've been silenced for so long. They've forgotten what it's like to be free. Ava's lips tightened. They've kept a tight grip on this town. But we can break it, Monroe. We can break them. As they made their final preparations, Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every second they wasted brought them closer to being discovered, closer to being trapped. But there was no turning back now. She turned to Ava, determination etched into her face. Let's move. The two women left the cabin quietly, disappearing into the woods. The first few steps of their plan were simple. Gather intel, find those who knew too much, and gain their trust. It wasn't long before they found their first lead, a former associate of Liam's who had worked with him on several cases. The man was nervous, clearly terrified of the people watching his every move. But when Monroe asked the right questions, the man's walls began to crack. They don't just run things here, the man whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. They have people everywhere, law enforcement, politicians, even in the media. They control the truth, and they bury anyone who gets too close. Monroe's gut tightened. This was bigger than she had imagined. Liam's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was a warning. And the people who killed him weren't just trying to silence him. They were trying to control everything. Who else knows? Monroe asked, her voice low but firm. People who were there, who saw things they shouldn't have. They're all gone. Disappeared, one way or another. The man's words hit her like a punch. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Liam had been just one of many people caught in their web. And now, Monroe was in too deep to walk away. But she wasn't scared. She wasn't backing down. As the man's story continued to unravel, Monroe felt the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. Liam had uncovered something so dark, so far-reaching, that it had made him a target. And now, it was her turn to finish what he had started. But the deeper Monroe dug, the more she realized how much danger she was in. The people they were up against weren't just criminals. They were a network, a system built on lies and power. And they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Ava glanced at Monroe, her expression hardening. They know we're getting close. We need to be careful. Monroe nodded. I know, but we can't wait any longer. They couldn't wait. Every moment was crucial. And Monroe was determined to expose the truth, no matter what it cost her. That night, as they planned their next move, The sound of a distant car engine echoed through the woods. Monroe's heart skipped a beat. It was too close. "They're here," Ava muttered, her voice laced with urgency. Monroe barely had time to react before the cabin door burst open. A group of masked figures entered, their faces hidden, their eyes cold and relentless. Ava grabbed Monroe's arm. "Run," she shouted. They bolted, racing through the back door and into the forest, but Monroe could already hear the crunch of footsteps behind them. They were being hunted. As they sprinted through the underbrush, Monroe's mind raced. She had to get to the evidence they had gathered. They couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. "Stay close," Ava urged. "We need to get to the safe house." But Monroe knew that time was running out. And in the dead of night, surrounded by enemies, she had no idea how this battle would end. But she was done being afraid. This was her fight now. Monroe's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, the sound of her footsteps barely louder than the pounding of her heart. Every breath she took felt like it could be her last. Ava led the way through the dense woods, her pace unrelenting. But Monroe wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up. The masked figures were closing in. The woods were no longer the sanctuary they once seemed. Now they felt like a trap. "Keep moving," Ava urged, her voice cutting through the night air like a command. Monroe's legs were starting to give out, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, then fainter. Ava glanced over her shoulder. "We've lost them for now, but we can't stop." Monroe's breath came in ragged gasps as she nodded. She didn't know where the safe house was, but she trusted Ava. She had to. "How much further?" Monroe asked, her voice shaky but determined. Ava's eyes scanned the trees, her face a mask of concentration. "We're close. Just a little longer." Suddenly, they emerged from the dense woods into a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, abandoned cabin. It was far from welcoming, its windows dark and cracked, but it was their only option. Ava darted toward the cabin, Monroe following as fast as she could, adrenaline fueling her every step. The door creaked open, and they rushed inside, slamming it shut behind them. The cabin was small, dimly lit by a single hanging light. Dust and cobwebs clung to the walls, the air thick with the smell of mildew. But Monroe didn't care about the state of the cabin. She was only concerned with survival and the evidence they needed to take down the people who had killed Liam. Ava locked the door behind them and moved quickly to a small desk in the corner of the room. "Everything we need is here," she said, pulling out a stack of papers, photographs, and files. Monroe watched her, her heart racing. "This is it, isn't it? The truth about Liam's murder." Ava nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she spread the documents out on the desk. "It's all here. The connections, the people involved, the cover-ups." Monroe stepped closer, her eyes scanning the papers. Liam had been digging into a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Brockford. High-level officials, powerful businessmen, and criminal syndicates. It wasn't just about murder. It was about power, control, and a conspiracy that had been thriving for years. "This is bigger than we thought," Monroe muttered, her voice filled with disbelief. "They were willing to kill to protect this." Ava's gaze was hard, her jaw clenched. "They'll do worse if they have to, but they're not going to get away with it." Monroe turned toward her, meeting her eyes. "I won't let them. Not after everything Liam uncovered." Ava handed her a photograph. It was a picture of Liam, standing with several other individuals, some familiar, others unknown. At the center of the group was a man Monroe recognized, the mayor of Brockford. "This is where it all started," Ava said, pointing at the mayor. "He was one of the first to get involved. From there, it spiraled out of control." Monroe's mind raced. The mayor had been involved? That explained a lot. But it also raised even more questions. Before she could speak, a sound outside caught her attention. A car engine, slow and deliberate. "They found us," Ava whispered, her voice tense. "We need to move now." Monroe's pulse quickened. They couldn't stay here. They were too exposed. Ava grabbed the stack of documents and stuffed them into a bag, then grabbed Monroe's arm. "Follow me. I know a place we can hide." As they slipped out the back door and into the dense woods once again, Monroe's mind was racing. The stakes had just become much higher. They weren't just fighting for Liam's justice anymore. They were fighting for their lives. The sound of the car grew louder, and Monroe felt a cold sense of dread wash over her. They were being hunted, and the people after them would stop at nothing to make sure they didn't get away. Ava pushed forward, leading Monroe through the underbrush, her movements swift and calculated. Monroe kept her head down, trying to stay silent, her heart pounding in her chest. They reached a small stream, and Ava signaled for Monroe to stop. "This is the last place they'll look," she said, her voice low. "We need to stay hidden until it's safe to move again." Monroe nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness. They were running out of time. Every moment they stayed in the open brought them closer to being caught. But she wasn't going to stop. Not now. She had the truth, and she was going to expose it, no matter the cost. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but Monroe's resolve only grew stronger. She was in this to the end. The night was thick with tension as Monroe and Ava crouched by the stream, trying to blend into the shadows. Every rustle of the leaves seemed too loud, too obvious. Monroe's senses were on high alert, her mind still racing with everything they had uncovered. They had a weapon now, the truth. But the truth was dangerous, and it was clear the people they were up against would do anything to keep it buried. Ava glanced at her, her face grim. "They won't stop looking for us. We need to keep moving." Monroe nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The chase was on, and they couldn't afford to be caught. A distant shout cut through the night air, echoing across the woods. A car door slammed. Footsteps crunched over the fallen leaves. "They're getting closer," Monroe whispered, her heart racing. Ava was already moving, pulling Monroe along with her. The dense trees were a blessing, offering cover as they sprinted deeper into the forest. But Monroe couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. They were closing in. Suddenly, a flash of headlights illuminated the path ahead. Monroe's breath caught in her throat. "We have to hide," Ava hissed, grabbing Monroe's arm and pulling her toward a nearby thicket. They crouched low, barely breathing as the vehicle passed by, its lights cutting through the darkness like a blade. Monroe held her breath, praying they wouldn't be spotted. The car slowed, then came to a stop. The sound of doors opening sent a jolt of panic through her chest. Footsteps. They were close now. Ava motioned for Monroe to stay quiet. Her heart was thundering in her ears as she forced herself to remain still, her body tense with fear. The footsteps drew nearer. Monroe could almost hear the voices of their pursuers now, murmuring just beyond the brush. Then suddenly the voices stopped. The footsteps faded away. Monroe dared to breathe, but only in shallow gasps. The forest around them felt suffocating in its stillness. Ava's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, they both let out a silent sigh of relief. "We can't stay here for long," Ava whispered. "Once they realize we're gone, they'll search the area. We need to get to the safe house. Now." Monroe nodded, her legs aching from the tension. They were running out of time, but the truth was within reach. They continued their journey, moving quickly but cautiously through the forest. The night seemed endless, but they had no choice but to press on. Finally, they reached a small clearing where a modest cabin stood. The windows were dark, and the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for them. Ava led the way, pushing the door open and ushering Monroe inside. The cabin was small but functional, with only the essentials: a bed, a few chairs, a small kitchen area. Ava locked the door behind them and moved quickly to a corner where a set of supplies had been hidden. "This is it," she said, her voice low. "This is where we can regroup, figure out our next move." Monroe collapsed into a chair, her body trembling with exhaustion. She hadn't realized just how much the chase had taken out of her. Ava handed her a bottle of water, and Monroe took it gratefully, her hands still shaking. "We're not safe here for long, are we?" she asked quietly. Ava shook her head. "They know we're close. They'll be on us soon enough. But we have time, just enough to plan our next move." Monroe took a deep breath, steeling herself. They couldn't keep running forever. It was time to fight back. "We have to expose them," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Everything they've done, everything they've hidden, it all comes out now. There's no turning back. Ava looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. Are you ready for that? They'll do anything to stop us. It's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been crushed under their thumb. Monroe's eyes hardened with resolve. I've been ready for this my whole life. The truth doesn't just need to be uncovered. It needs to be shared. And I'll make sure it is, no matter the cost. Ava nodded slowly. We'll need to be smart. They have eyes everywhere, but we have one thing they don't. Monroe raised an eyebrow, curious. Us, Ava said with a small, determined smile. They don't expect us to fight back. They think we're just two women with a few documents. But we're more than that. We have the truth on our side. Monroe felt a surge of determination course through her. Ava was right. They weren't just victims in this. They were warriors for the truth. Let's take them down, Monroe said, her voice fierce. One by one. We won't stop until the whole town knows the truth about Liam's murder and everything that came after it. Ava's eyes gleamed with purpose. We'll need allies, resources, and a plan. But we can do this. Together. Monroe stood up, a fire burning in her chest. She was done running. The war had just begun. Monroe and Ava worked quickly, their minds focused on their next steps. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on their shoulders, but they were no longer afraid. Ava moved to the corner, pulling out a map and marking several locations. We'll start with the mayor's office. We have the evidence we need to make a dent in this. Monroe nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of the map. They had to expose the connections between the mayor and the criminal syndicates. Everything from bribery to the orchestrated killings. It would be a long shot, but it was the key to unraveling the entire network. We need to be strategic, Monroe said, her voice low but determined. Any wrong move, and they'll bury us before we even get a chance to speak. Ava looked up, her expression hard. We won't give them that chance. We're going to hit them where it hurts. They spent the next few hours strategizing, assembling a plan that would take them through the heart of the town's corruption. They needed to expose the mayor, but they also needed the public on their side. It was a dangerous game. One misstep, and they would find themselves in the crosshairs of those they were fighting. By the time the sun had risen, Monroe was ready. They had everything they needed, documents, photos, and a network of contacts who could help them get the truth to the people. They weren't just going to tell the story. They were going to make sure everyone knew it. Ava stood at the door, checking their supplies one last time. You ready? Monroe took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. No turning back. As ready as I'll ever be, she replied. They left the cabin, moving swiftly through the woods, their steps quick and sure. Every sense was heightened. Every noise, every shadow felt like a potential threat. But they had a purpose now, and that purpose was driving them forward. As they approached the town, Monroe's heart raced. The streets were quiet, eerily so, as though the town itself was holding its breath. But she could feel it, the tension in the air, the unease that hung over everything. People knew something was coming, and they needed to be ready. They made their way to the mayor's office, slipping past security with practiced ease. It was time to make the first move in their plan. Inside, the mayor's office was opulent, a stark contrast to the town's crumbling streets outside. Rich wood paneling, expensive paintings on the walls, and a heavy desk made the place feel cold and imposing. But Monroe wasn't intimidated. This man's wealth had been built on lies, on blood, and he would pay for it. Ava moved quickly, placing the documents and photos on the mayor's desk. Monroe stood by the door, keeping watch. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to expose the truth. The mayor entered moments later, his face hardening when he saw the evidence laid out before him. "How dare you come in here?" he growled, his voice filled with anger. Monroe stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. "You're going to answer for what you've done," she said, her voice unwavering. "You've been running this town for far too long, hiding behind your power and corruption. But we're here to make sure the world knows the truth about you." His eyes flickered with something, fear, anger, or maybe both. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he spat. "I'll destroy you both before you can say another word." But Monroe wasn't scared. She had the truth, and the truth was unstoppable. "Go ahead," she said, her voice cold. "Try to destroy us. But it won't work. We've already won." The mayor's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew they weren't bluffing. Ava pressed a button on the desk, triggering a live broadcast that filled the entire town square with images of the mayor's dark dealings. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The mayor rushed forward, but it was too late. Monroe and Ava had already set the wheels in motion. As the mayor's secrets were exposed to the entire town, Monroe felt a sense of justice wash over her. But she knew this was just the beginning. There were still many more people to bring down, many more truths to uncover. The road ahead was uncertain, but Monroe was ready. She had survived too much to back down now. Ava turned to her, a grim smile on her face. "We've done it, Monroe. But we can't stop here." Monroe nodded, determination burning in her chest. "This isn't over. We're going to take down every last one of them." And with that, they stepped into the unknown, ready to bring the fight to those who thought they were untouchable. The sound of footsteps echoed in the empty office as Monroe and Ava left the mayor's office. The adrenaline was still pumping through their veins, but there was no time to savor the victory. They had taken down the first piece of the puzzle, but the rest of the conspiracy was vast and dangerous. Their fight was far from over. Ava looked at Monroe with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "We did it, but now we need to stay ahead. They'll come after us, and we can't afford to let our guard down." Monroe nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow. The weight of their actions was starting to settle in. They had exposed the mayor. Yes, but there were still many more who were part of this web of corruption, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. "We keep moving," Monroe said, her voice steady. "There's no turning back now. We've already lit the fire. Now we need to watch it burn." They left the mayor's office and disappeared into the maze of streets. They needed to get to their next destination, one of their contacts who could help them broadcast the evidence to the world. They couldn't rely on traditional news outlets. This had to be global, a shockwave that would ripple through the system. But even as they moved forward, Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows felt heavier now, the streets colder. She quickened her pace, but Ava's hand on her arm stopped her. "We're being followed," Ava whispered, her voice low and urgent. Monroe's heart raced. She looked over her shoulder. It was too dark to see anyone clearly, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "We need to split up," Ava said. "Take a different route. Meet me back at the safe house in 2 hours." Monroe hesitated. She didn't want to be alone, not now. But she knew Ava was right. They couldn't afford to be cornered. "Be careful," Monroe said, her voice strained. Ava gave her a tight nod. "You too." With that, they separated, each taking a different route through the town. Monroe moved quickly through the alleyways, every sense heightened. She couldn't let them catch her. As she reached the corner, she spotted a group of men in dark suits, a dangerous mix of authority and menace. They were scanning the streets, searching for someone. Monroe's pulse quickened. She ducked into a side alley, hoping they hadn't seen her. Her mind raced. Who could they be? Were they connected to the mayor's people? Or was this a new threat? The men walked past, their eyes scanning every corner, but they didn't stop. Monroe held her breath, barely daring to move. The tension was unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, the men continued on their way. Monroe exhaled, her body trembling from the close call. But there was no time to waste. She had to keep moving. Her mind was fixed on the one thing she knew. Whatever happened next, she had to finish what they started. She had to take down the rest of the network, expose every corrupt soul in this town, and make sure no one else would fall victim to their twisted game. 2 hours later, Monroe arrived back at the safe house, her legs aching from the constant movement. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Ava was already there, pacing the floor. Her face was grim, her eyes filled with concern. "You made it," Ava said, relief evident in her voice. Monroe nodded. "I lost them barely, but I'm not sure how much longer we can keep running." Ava's expression hardened. "They'll be coming for us. It's only a matter of time before they figure out we're not going to back down." Monroe sat down, her body heavy with exhaustion. But we're not backing down. We've come this far. We can't let them win. Ava agreed, but her eyes were sharp with the weight of their next move. We need to find a way to make them pay. We need more allies. The people in power won't stop until they silence us. Monroe looked at the stack of evidence on the table. Photos, documents, recordings. This was it. This was their weapon, their ammunition. We'll get the rest of the truth out there, Monroe said, her voice low but unwavering. We'll go public with everything. The world needs to know who these people are, and they need to know what they've done. Ava's face was lit by a flickering light from the lamp as she leaned in. And then we make sure they can never hurt anyone again. Monroe stood up, feeling the weight of the burden, but with a fire in her chest that wouldn't be extinguished. This was bigger than her. This was about justice, and she wasn't going to stop until she got it. The following days blurred into one another as Monroe and Ava plunged deeper into their mission. The quiet moments between their frantic searches were the only time they allowed themselves to process the weight of their actions. They knew their every move was being watched, but they refused to slow down. Each new lead brought them closer to the heart of the conspiracy, and with each step, they uncovered more dangerous truths. But they also knew that the more they exposed, the more powerful their enemies became. One night, as they sifted through new evidence in their safe house, Monroe leaned back, rubbing her eyes. The deeper we go, the more twisted it gets. The mayor is just a small part of this. Ava looked over at her, a grim determination in her eyes. I know, but we can't back out now. They're not just going to let us walk away. They'll do anything to protect themselves. Monroe sighed, her mind racing with the weight of everything they had uncovered. How do we stop them? How do we take them down for good? Ava glanced at the pile of documents, photos, and recordings on the table. We make sure the world sees it all. We go to the media. We don't just release it. We expose every single person involved, from the mayor to the cops to the businessmen pulling the strings. Monroe nodded, her heart heavy with the enormity of their task. It was the only way. They couldn't let their lives be destroyed in vain. But as she stared out the window, a sudden feeling washed over her. It wasn't fear, but something much worse, a sense of dread, as if a storm was brewing just on the horizon. I have a bad feeling about this, Monroe muttered. Something's not right. Ava's face darkened. You're not wrong. They've got eyes everywhere. If we do this, it won't be easy. But Monroe was resolute. We're not backing down. The plan was set into motion the very next morning. They contacted a trusted journalist, someone who had long been on the fringes of the establishment and was known for exposing corruption, no matter how powerful the people behind it were. But as they made their way to meet the journalist, something unexpected happened. They had been followed. Monroe felt at first another shadow in the corner of her vision. She glanced quickly over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. A black SUV turned a corner and came into view, its headlights cutting through the morning fog. Ava stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun they kept hidden in her jacket. Stay calm. We'll lose them in the next block, she whispered. But Monroe wasn't so sure. This wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever was following them knew exactly what they were doing. The SUV slowed, creeping along behind them, its engine rumbling ominously. Ava turned sharply down a side street, hoping to shake them off. But the vehicle followed. Monroe's mind raced. We can't keep running like this. Ava's jaw clenched. We're going to make a stand. This is it. They ducked into an alley, a narrow, dimly lit passage that ran between two buildings. But the SUV was right behind them now. Before they could react, the sound of screeching tires filled the air, and the vehicle stopped. The doors flew open, and several figures dressed in black emerged. Ava immediately pulled Monroe into a crouch behind an old dumpster. We need to fight. We can't let them take us. Monroe's heart hammered in her chest, the cold metal of the gun in her hand offering little comfort. The men were closing in, their footsteps growing louder. Ava signaled to her. On 3. 1, 2, 3. They moved in perfect sync, darting out of cover with the precision of trained professionals. But it wasn't enough. The men were fast, too fast. In an instant, they were surrounded. Monroe and Ava were forced to the ground, their hands pinned behind their backs. One of the men, tall and imposing, leaned over Monroe with a cold smile. "You've been a thorn in our side for far too long," he said. "Now, you're going to disappear?" Monroe's heart sank, but she didn't let fear consume her. "You'll never get away with this," she spat, her voice fierce. "We have everything. The world will know what you've done." The man's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see about that." As the men began to drag them to the SUV, Monroe felt the world narrowing, her thoughts a haze of fear and anger. But then, just as all seemed lost, there was a flash of movement. Ava kicked one of the men in the leg, throwing him off balance. The man stumbled, and she quickly grabbed the gun from his holster. Monroe didn't hesitate. Together, they fought back with everything they had. A vicious struggle ensued, but their will to survive was stronger than the men who tried to take them down. In the chaos, one of the attackers went down, clutching his side as blood began to stain his shirt. The remaining men hesitated for just a moment, and that was all they needed. Monroe grabbed Ava's hand, pulling her into a run. The two women sprinted down the alley, their lungs burning, their hearts racing. Behind them, shouts echoed, but they didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. Not now. As they turned another corner, they spotted the journalist waiting in a car, just as planned. Without a word, they jumped in, slamming the door behind them. The car sped off, leaving the chaos and the men behind. Monroe exhaled sharply, her body trembling from the rush of fear and adrenaline. Ava turned to her, a wild smile crossing her face. "We made it out, but we can't stop. This fight is far from over." Monroe nodded, her resolve hardening once again. "No matter what it takes, we're going to finish this." And with that, they plunged forward into the unknown, knowing their enemies were only growing stronger, and that they couldn't afford to stop until the truth was out. Weeks had passed since that harrowing escape. Monroe and Ava had not stopped, not for a moment. They knew the dangers they faced, but they also knew they couldn't give in. The fight for justice had become more than just their mission. It was a reckoning that would shake the foundations of their entire town. As the days wore on, they worked tirelessly behind the scenes, connecting with more whistleblowers, gathering evidence, and reaching out to those brave enough to stand with them. Their names were now known to the public, symbols of defiance against a corrupt system. But even as the walls closed in, the two women felt a sense of triumph building in their chests. They were no longer running in fear. They were now part of something bigger, a movement that could no longer be silenced. Finally, the moment arrived. The evidence they had worked so hard to gather was ready for release. They had worked out a deal with a global media outlet, one that could ensure the truth reached every corner of the world. The story was set to go live at midnight, and the weight of the truth, every document, every recording, every confession, was about to be revealed. In the final moments before the broadcast went live, Monroe and Ava stood in the small, dimly lit room, their faces lit only by the glow of the computer screens. Monroe couldn't help but smile, a small, knowing smile that spoke of all the obstacles they had overcome. "This is it," Monroe whispered. "The end of their reign. The start of a new beginning." Ava nodded, her eyes filled with a fierce satisfaction. "We've exposed the truth. Now it's up to the world to take action." The countdown began. As the clock struck midnight, the story went live. The truth was out there. No more hiding, no more lies. The world watched as the mayor, the syndicates, and the powerful elites fell one by one. The people who had once been victims now stood as agents of change. The authorities were forced into action, the justice system slowly but surely taking down those who thought themselves untouchable. Monroe and Ava watched from their safe house, knowing the road ahead would still be long and uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves a moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, but it had taken a decisive turn. Together, they had made the impossible possible. And as they sat in the silence of that room, they knew one thing for certain: they had won.